The wrist. That is where it begins. Not with a punch, not with a shout, not with the crash of bodies hitting the floor. It begins with a single hand, thick as a cinder block, calloused from 15 years of pulling ox carts and training drills, closing around Bruce Lee's left wrist like a steel trap snapping shut. The gymnasium in Hong Kong's Kowloon district held its breath. 47 witnesses, one frozen second, and a 135-pound man in street clothes standing perfectly still while a 500-kilogram class Soviet wrestling champion squeezed with the kind of force that had, on 3 separate occasions, dislocated the wrists of trained competitors. Bruce Lee did not pull away. He did not flinch. His eyes, and every person in that room would later remark on this, each independently, each unprompted, his eyes became very quiet, not calm the way a man is calm before he loses, calm the way still water is calm before it moves. 3 seconds passed. Then the wrestler was on the ground. Nobody could explain what they had seen. Not the wrestlers, not the martial artists, not the journalists standing in the back corner with their notepads. 3 seconds. One wrist. One lesson that lasted a lifetime. This is that story. The date was March 14th, 1967. The location, the Mong Kok Athletic Institute, a 3rd-floor gymnasium on Portland Street in Kowloon, Hong Kong. A building that smelled of pine resin and decades of compressed sweat, its walls yellowed by the condensation of 1,000 training sessions. It was a Wednesday afternoon, just after 3 o'clock, and the light through the high rectangular windows fell in slanted columns across the mat. Hong Kong in March sits at the knife edge between cool and humid, and that afternoon the gymnasium air was thick enough to feel on your skin, the kind of atmosphere that made every movement heavier than it should be. The man standing at the center of that mat was named Arkady Voronov. To understand what happened that afternoon, you have to understand who Arkady Voronov was, because what happened only means something if you understand who he was when he walked in. Voronov was 31 years old. He stood 6 feet, 4 inches tall, and weighed 263 pounds. Not the rolling, soft weight of a man who has eaten well, but the dense, architectural weight of a man built the way bridge supports are built, every pound serving a structural purpose. His shoulders were broad enough that he had to angle himself slightly sideways through standard door frames, a habit so ingrained he did it automatically, even when it wasn't necessary. His credentials were not decoration. They were documentation. Voronov held a Master of Sport in Greco-Roman wrestling, the Soviet Union's highest athletic designation below the Olympic medal podium. His competitive record at that point stood at 61 wins, 2 losses, and both losses had come in his first year of competition, before he had learned to use his reach properly. In the 9 years since, he had not lost once. He had competed at the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, advancing to the quarterfinals before a points decision went against him, a result he considered, with characteristic bluntness, a political outcome rather than the sporting one. His training regime was the kind of thing that reads like fiction. 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, since the age of 14. He could hold a 180-pound man, suspended in the air for 40 seconds, using only his grip and core pressure. His neck circumference measured 19 inches. His resting heart rate was 44 beats per minute. He had trained under 3 Soviet national coaches and had himself begun coaching the Hong Kong Wrestling Development Program as part of a cultural exchange initiative, which was why he was in that gymnasium on that particular Wednesday afternoon. Voronov was not, by nature, a cruel man. The people who knew him described him as precise, methodical, occasionally impatient with imprecision, but never gratuitously aggressive. He believed, deeply and without apology, that wrestling was the foundational martial discipline, that all other combat sports were derivative of the clinch, the throw, the ground control that wrestling had refined over 3,000 years of human competition. He had expressed this view before. He would express it again. And on that Wednesday afternoon in Kowloon, he expressed it in front of an audience that included, standing near the back wall in a dark blue collared shirt and plain trousers, a 26-year-old man from San Francisco who had recently been described by Black Belt magazine as the most dangerous martial artist in the world. Voronov did not recognize him, or perhaps more precisely, Voronov saw him and did not adjust his assessment of the room. A slight young man, civilian clothes. No GI. No training shoes. No visible indication of anything that would warrant recalibrating the social calculus of the afternoon. But here is where it changes. Because 3 people in that room did recognize Bruce Lee. And not one of them said a word. They simply shifted their weight, moved slightly closer to the walls, and waited. Bruce Lee had not planned to be in that gymnasium on that afternoon. He was in Hong Kong visiting family, his parents' home on Nathan Road, a trip he made when his schedule permitted, which in 1967 was not often. The previous 18 months had consumed him. The television series, The Schools, the evolving architecture of Jeet Kune Do, the philosophical notebooks that were filling faster than he could write in them. He was lean even by his own standards that month, 135 pounds, the kind of lean that comes not from restriction, but from constant movement, from a body that had learned to run at a higher metabolic rate than most people achieve even in exertion. He had come to the Mong Kok Athletic Institute because a friend, a student from his Oakland school, visiting Hong Kong on business, had mentioned the wrestling demonstration. Bruce was, by this point in his development, pathologically curious about any martial discipline he had not fully mapped. Greco-Roman wrestling was on that list. He came not to demonstrate anything. He came to watch. He stood near the back wall with his arms loose at his sides, one shoulder slightly forward, his weight distributed in a way that looked casual to anyone not trained to see it. His hands, and this is what the 3 people who recognized him noticed, his hands were extraordinary. The knuckles of his right hand bore the compressed, layered callus tissue of someone who had performed 10,000 straight punch repetitions against a wooden dummy board, not the padded glove callus of a boxer. The hard, specific callus of a man who had repeatedly struck immovable objects at full force. He watched Voronov demonstrate a double-leg takedown on a willing partner. He watched the effortlessness of it. The way Voronov's center of gravity dropped and rotated simultaneously in a single motion that covered 3 feet of distance in less than half a second. Bruce's eyes tracked the technique with the same quality of attention a master calligrapher gives to the movement of a brush, not evaluating, not comparing. Absorbing. He said nothing. He asked no questions. And then Voronov, scanning the room during a pause, made eye contact with him. What happened next, nobody expected. Voronov's interpreter, a young Hong Kong man named Seng, who worked for the Cultural Exchange Program, relayed the question. He wants to know if you're here to train, or just to observe. The room had perhaps 30 people in it at that moment. Wrestlers in training clothes, 2 coaches, several officials from the Hong Kong Athletic Federation, the 3 who had recognized Bruce Lee, a journalist from the South China Morning Post who had come to cover the Soviet coach's visit and was now holding his pen very still. Bruce Lee answered in Cantonese, quietly, and Seng translated. He said he was only watching. He said the demonstration had been instructive. Voronov, through Seng, pressed further. He said, in the way that men of his physical magnitude sometimes say things, not as a threat exactly, but as a statement of what they consider to be obvious fact, that watching a wrestling demonstration without understanding the grip was like watching a piano concert without understanding the keys. He said that anyone who claimed to practice combat arts seriously should understand what a controlling grip felt like from the inside. The room went very quiet. Bruce Lee's internal register of the moment was, by all subsequent accounts from people who knew how he processed confrontation, something close to mathematical. He was not angry. He was calculating angles, distances, the specific geometry of what Voronov had just proposed. He understood that the challenge had been issued in front of witnesses, that it had been issued with genuine pedagogical sincerity. Voronov was not a bully. He was a true believer, and that refusing would accomplish nothing instructive for anyone present. He also understood something Voronov did not yet understand, that the moment the grip was established, the demonstration would be over very quickly. A man near the front, one of the Hong Kong Federation officials, a heavy-set man in a white short-sleeved shirt, took 2 steps forward and said, in English, that perhaps this wasn't the right format for an exchange, that the cultural program wasn't designed for. Bruce Lee, without looking at him, raised one hand slightly, not a silencing gesture, a gesture that said, I have already decided. He turned back toward the center of the mat and walked toward Voronov. He removed nothing. He loosened nothing. He rolled up no sleeves. He walked in his street clothes to the center of the mat, stopped at a distance of approximately 4 feet, and waited. The South China Morning Post journalist later wrote, in his private notes that would not be published for 23 years, that the atmosphere in that room in the 30 seconds before contact was unlike anything he had experienced at a sporting event. He described it as the feeling before a crack of thunder. The air pressure, he said, seemed different. 61 wins, 2 losses. And then Arkady Voronov met Bruce Lee. Voronov stepped forward and extended his right hand. Not a handshake, a grip. The specific grip of a Greco-Roman wrestler establishing control of an opponent's wrist before a throw sequence, thumb beneath, for fingers wrapped over, the rotational torque already preloaded in the forearm. He had used this grip in competition 47 times. It had never failed to give him a positional advantage. His hand closed around Bruce Lee's left wrist. In the first second, Voronov applied 60% of his maximum grip force, what he later described as a testing pressure, the kind he used to read an opponent's immediate response. Most trained athletes tensed instinctively against it. The resistance they offered told him which way to redirect their energy for the throw. Bruce Lee offered no resistance. This is not the same as going limp. Going limp is a passive response, and passivity has a texture, a collapse, a surrender of structural integrity. What Bruce Lee's arm offered instead was what practitioners of Jeet Kune Do's borrowed Wing Chun principles call Wu Wei tension, the absence of counterforce while maintaining complete structural alignment. His arm remained precisely positioned. His elbow angle did not change. His shoulder did not drop. Voronov increased to 80% force. His forearm muscles that had generated enough force to crack a wooden practice post during a 1965 training session documented by a Soviet coaching staff, compressed harder around Bruce Lee's wrist bones. In the second, Bruce Lee moved. The movement was not large. That is the thing the witnesses struggled to describe afterward. They expected something dramatic, a spin, a strike, a visible explosion of technique. What they saw instead was almost nothing. A rotation, an almost imperceptible shift of Bruce Lee's elbow inward and downward, a movement that covered perhaps 4 inches of space, performed at a speed that several witnesses later estimated at somewhere between 30 and 50 milliseconds. What that movement accomplished was this. It changed the mechanical relationship between Voronov's grip and Voronov's own shoulder joint. The Jeet Kune Do principle at work is sometimes called centerline redirection, the understanding that a force applied along an opponent's arm can be redirected not by meeting it, but by altering the structural chain through which it travels. Bruce Lee's 4-inch elbow rotation transferred Voronov's own grip force backward through Voronov's wrist, into his forearm, up through his elbow, and directly into his shoulder in a mechanical sequence that his shoulder joint was not designed to absorb from that angle. That's not a trick. That's physics applied with surgical precision. In the 3rd second, the crowd went silent. Voronov's knees bent. Not dramatically. Not the way they bend when a man is thrown or struck. They bent the way knees bend when the body's weight-bearing calculation has been suddenly invalidated. A slight, involuntary flex, the body seeking a lower center of gravity in response to structural information it could not process quickly enough. His right arm, the arm with the grip, extended involuntarily, straightened, the grip released, and Arkady Voronov, 61 wins and 2 losses, a man who had held suspended opponents in the air for 40 seconds, went down, not with a crash, not with a slam. He went down the way a structure goes down when a single load-bearing element is removed, progressively, almost gently, until he was on one knee on the mat, and Bruce Lee was standing 4 feet away from him, having taken no step backward, having moved only his forearm. Bruce Lee did not press forward. He did not follow up. He stepped back, that deliberate, specific step back that every person in that room would remember, and stood still. The silence lasted 4 seconds. A journalist counted them. He later told 3 separate interviewers, for seconds of absolute silence in a room with 30 people, in a city of 3 million, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in March. That is not a demonstration of strength. That is something that has no adequate name in any martial arts vocabulary, from any culture. They spoke privately. That much is certain. The witnesses all confirmed that the main room cleared by common, unspoken agreement. The way people remove themselves from the perimeter of something they instinctively understand is not for general consumption. Sang, the interpreter, remained. He would later describe the conversation as the strangest 20 minutes of his professional life, not because of what was said, but because of the quality of attention both men brought to it. Neither was performing. Neither was defending. Voronov asked, through Sang, a direct question. He asked how it was mechanically possible for a 135-pound man to redirect the force of his grip using a movement that, by his calculation, should not have been strong enough. Bruce Lee sat on the edge of the mat and answered without hesitation. He said that the question contained its own error. He said, "You were asking your strength to do the work your structure should have done. I did not match your strength. I changed the question your strength was trying to answer." Sang struggled with the translation. He said later that the Cantonese equivalent of what Bruce Lee had said was a koan, the kind of statement that is technically translatable but functionally opaque, unless you have already understood it from experience. Voronov was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that Sang would remember verbatim for the rest of his life. He said, "In 15 years, I have learned to move my body. In 3 seconds, you showed me I have not yet learned where my body ends." That is the line, the one that echoes. Bruce Lee did not respond to it as a compliment. He responded to it as a question, which, given the precision of Voronov's phrasing, was the only honest response available. He spoke for perhaps 10 minutes about the concept he was, at that time, still articulating for himself. The principle that every body has a mechanical conversation with every other body it contacts, and that the most powerful intervention in any such conversation is not to speak louder, but to change the language. Be water. Not because water is soft, because water responds to the exact shape of what it meets, finds the available space, and exerts its nature without forcing anything. Before they parted, Voronov did something that Sang had never seen him do in 8 months of working together. He bowed. Not a competitive bow, not the formal exchange of athletic courtesy. A real bow, from the waist, held for a full 3 seconds. Bruce Lee returned it without hesitation. They shook hands. Voronov held Bruce Lee's right hand in both of his for a moment, looked at it, at the knuckles, at the structure of it, and then looked up and said one more thing through Sang. He said, "You are already teaching. You should be careful what your students learn to imitate and what they learn to understand." Bruce Lee carried that line with him. It appeared nearly verbatim in his philosophical notebooks from 1968 onward. Years later, 1974, a year after Bruce Lee's death, Arkady Voronov returned to Hong Kong as head coach of the Soviet Greco-Roman wrestling delegation for an international youth tournament. He requested, through the organizing committee, an afternoon at the Mong Kok Athletic Institute. No official reason given. He sat on the same mat for 2 hours. He watched young wrestlers train. He said almost nothing. Afterward, he gave an interview to a Hong Kong sports journalist, a brief one, conducted through a new interpreter since Sang had by then moved to Canada. And the journalist, perhaps testing him, asked what he thought of Bruce Lee's martial arts legacy, now that Lee had become a global cultural phenomenon. Voronov paused for a long time before answering. He said, "He did not teach me a technique. He showed me a principle I had been standing on top of for 15 years, without knowing it was there." His students, the wrestlers he coached through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, describe a particular obsession in his coaching philosophy that emerged in those years. He became almost evangelical about what he called structural honesty, the idea that a fighter must understand where their force actually comes from, not where they believe it comes from. He made his wrestlers train blindfolded. He made them practice grip work with their non-dominant hands until the dominant hand learned what it had been compensating for. His coaching produced 2 Olympic medalists and 4 World Championship finalists between 1976 and 1984. He never publicly attributed this methodology to the Wednesday afternoon in Kowloon, but 3 of his students, interviewed separately over the years, described a habit he had when a young wrestler finally understood the structural principle he had been teaching for weeks. He would stop the session. He would nod once, and he would say quietly, as though to himself, "Now you are asking the right question." The echoes travel forward. Return to the gymnasium. Return to the mat. A 500-kilogram class wrestling champion with 61 wins. A grip that had dislocated trained competitors' wrists on 3 documented occasions, and 15 years of elite training. And a 135-pound man in street clothes who did not raise his voice, did not change his expression, and moved 4 inches. 3 seconds. 1 principle. 1 legacy still teaching. And here is what that moment was. It was not a victory. It was a translation. It was not a demonstration of what Bruce Lee could do. It was a demonstration of what Voronov had always been capable of understanding. If someone had changed the question. 1 movement. 1 principle. 1 afternoon in March 1967 that neither man ever fully stopped living inside. But there's one encounter from that same Hong Kong visit, something that happened 2 days later, in a different part of the city, witnessed by even fewer people, that Bruce Lee himself never described publicly, not in interviews, not in his notebooks, not to his closest students. The reason he stayed silent about it for the rest of his life, that is a story for another time.